So let's look at a couple examples. This is typical. They'll say graph this particular transformation of cosine. And of course, your handy dandy calculator is really good at graphing those sorts of things. But we're not doing this just to get a pretty picture, and pretty though it may be. We're graphing for understanding. So we'll want to graph this thing by hand so we have a better idea of what's actually going on. But before we tackle this one, though, let's tackle this one. Let's reverse that process. Let's say if you have a graph already, can you come up with the equation that generates that graph? And let's start by figuring out the amplitude and the period and the phase shift. So let's see if we can work out from the graph what the amplitude is and the period, and excuse me, not the phase shift, the vertical shift is what we're interested in. Okay, so keep in mind amplitude is the distance from the sort of the middle of the curve up to the top, highest point. And you could also think of it as the middle of the curve down to the lowest point. And in either direction, so there's a midline here. From 1 up to 4 is a distance of 3, and from 1 down to -2. So either from the middle to the high or the middle to the low. Either way, we can see that the amplitude of this particular thing is 3 units. For the period, that's this side-to-side space that it takes to complete one cycle. We can see it starts at 0 and it ends at pi over 3. And that is one complete cycle. So we do have a period of exactly pi over 3. And we can also see there's a vertical shift. That green dotted sort of center line of the graph is not at 0, which means it's actually been shifted up. And we can see it's been shifted up by exactly 1 unit. So with that much, hopefully we can create the equation of this graph. So the amplitude's 3. So that goes there. This, since it starts sort of at its midline and then goes up and then goes down, this looks like a sine function to me, not a cosine function. So we'll do 3 sine of, and I'm going to go ahead and just stick the vertical shift on the end because that's easy. We know how to do that. And say +1 on there. The only thing left in here is there's a multiplier in front of t that changes the period from 2 pi to pi over 3. And keep in mind that that number right there is not actually going to be pi over 3. It's going to be the number that divides 2 pi and produces pi over 3. And if you remember from before, we had a little formula that said the period is the original period, 2 pi, divided by this omega number in here. So if we want a period of pi over 3, we can set that up. We can say a period of pi over 3 is our desired period. And we know that the omega comes from taking the original period, 2 pi, and dividing it, producing pi over 3. If you want to, you can cross multiply, or you can solve this however you like solving fractions that are equal to each other. But eventually, you come out with omega being equal to 6. I think you can see 2 pi over 6 reduces to pi over 3. So we will want a full equation there of y equals sine of 6t plus 1. And it's never a bad idea to actually grab your calculator now and just double check. I don't know how well this is going to show up, but we'll do y equals 3 sine of 6x, your calculator has to use x, plus 1. And I'm just going to do maybe I'll set my window by hand actually. So 0 to pi over 3 and -2 to 4. And let's take a look and see how that looks. Okay, it's looking pretty much like what it should look like, so I feel pretty good about that. All right, now let's come back to this one where they ask us to graph this particular function. And I'd like to start off the same way, which is just to say, what's the amplitude? What's the period? And what's the vertical shift? Again, since I lack creativity, the amplitude is right here. It's 3. The vertical shift is right there, -2. Those two are easy. Period, of course, is a little bit harder, but we know that it's 2 pi divided by omega, 2 pi divided by 4, so the period is actually pi over 2. Okay, so let's see if we can sketch a graph of this thing. And I think what I'm actually going to do is just sketch a graph without the vertical shift first. And then when I am done with that, I'm just going to shift the whole thing down by 2 units. So I'm pretending for the moment that the vertical shift isn't there. And I'm just doing the amplitude and the period. So this is a cosine. So it starts at the top. And then it goes down and comes back up. Oops, comes back up. And since the amplitude is 3, that's going to go to a height of 3 and a depth of -3. And since the period is pi over 2, this is going to go from 0 to pi over 2. So that's what the graph would look like if it was not shifted by -2. Since it is shifted by -2, I'm just going to take that whole thing and move it down 2 units. So this height of 3 becomes a height of 1. This, and then the whole thing just kind of follows along like that. This depth of -3 will become a depth of -5. And there is my graph of y equals 3 cosine of 4t minus 2.